The last thing the congregation said together, before the organist played and people began gathering their coats, was the Lord's Prayer. I had attended that church for the better part of 50 years. I had said those words in that building hundreds of times. I had said them at hospital bedsides, in Sunday school classrooms, at church potlucks, when someone thought it appropriate to close with a prayer we could all say together. I had said them over my father's casket in 1991. I said them the morning my wife left the house for her last chemotherapy appointment, both of us standing in the kitchen before I drove her. The day I am thinking of was 2020, a November afternoon, cold and flat outside. The sanctuary was at limited capacity because of the pandemic, so the people who loved her most were spaced out across the pews in a way that felt wrong. A feeling of absence, even within the room. When the pastor indicated we should close with the Lord's Prayer, the voices that joined in were fewer than they should have been, and I was aware of that in a way I hadn't expected. We got to the end together. For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. I had said that ending probably 10,000 times in my life. I knew the weight of it, the cadence of it, the particular way a room of people comes to rest on that final word, voices dropping slightly, a kind of collective exhale. I said it that day with everyone else and then sat down, and that was that. I am not sure what made me go looking. Grief does things to a person that are hard to name. In the months after that November, I found myself reading more carefully than I ever had. Not to find comfort exactly, though I was looking for something, but more because careful reading was the only form of attention I had left that felt honest. I'd been teaching history for 35 years by reading primary sources and asking where the evidence pointed. After my wife died, that habit turned itself onto the texts I had always read the other way, the way the institution had taught me, receiving, not examining. Sometime in the late winter of that year, I couldn't tell you the exact date, but I remember the light coming through the half-open blinds, the house quiet, a mug of coffee going cold at the edge of the desk. I was working through the 6th chapter of Matthew. I had printed out the relevant pages from the Codex Sinaiticus website. The British Library had digitized the entire manuscript and put it online, free for anyone to read. I'd been using it for a couple of years by then, checking things that nagged at me, comparing what the oldest surviving complete New Testament actually said against what my King James said. Matthew chapter 6, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaching his disciples how to pray. I followed the text. Verse 9, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Verse 10, Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Verse 11, Give us this day our daily bread. Verse 12, And forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. Verse 13, And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Full stop. I looked at the page for a moment, then I looked again, thinking I had missed something. A line break, a lacuna, some marking indicating a missing section. There was nothing. Matthew 6:13 in the Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest surviving complete New Testament on earth, preserved at St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, and now housed at the British Library, dated to approximately 330 to 360 CE, ends at, Deliver us from evil. Period. No doxology, not a footnote, not an ellipsis. The prayer ends there, the way a prayer ends when someone simply stops praying. I sat very still for a long time. I thought about November. I thought about the voices in that half-empty sanctuary. I thought about, For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. The most triumphant line in the prayer, the line that feels like the whole thing is building toward it, the line I had said at my father's funeral and at my wife's, and I thought, that line is not here. Now the Codex Sinaiticus is one manuscript, one document. A historian knows better than to stake a claim on a single source, so I went looking for the second witness. The Codex Vaticanus is housed in the Vatican Library. It is, along with Sinaiticus, one of the two oldest surviving complete New Testaments we have. Scholars date it to approximately 300 to 325 CE, slightly older than Sinaiticus. It has been in the Vatican's possession since at least 1475, when it first appears in their catalogue. For centuries, it was nearly inaccessible to outside scholars. By now, images of it are available through academic databases, and I had access. Vaticanus ends Matthew 6:13 at exactly the same place. Deliver us from evil. Nothing after it. The doxology is absent. Two oldest complete Bibles on earth. Both end the Lord's Prayer at deliver us from evil. Not one of them, both of them, independently preserved in completely different manuscript traditions, one in the deserts of Egypt and Sinai, one in Rome. I wrote that down on the legal pad I keep on the desk. Two witnesses. Both say the same thing. The doxology is not there. But there was a third check I needed to run. Luke also records Jesus teaching the Lord's Prayer, Luke chapter 11 verses 2 through 4. Luke's version is shorter than Matthew's. It doesn't have, "Thy will be done in earth, as it is in heaven," for instance. But the question I had was simple. Does Luke's version in any Greek manuscript ever found include the doxology? The answer is no. In every Greek manuscript of Luke chapter 11 ever catalogued, and there are hundreds of them spanning different manuscript families, different centuries, different geographical origins, there is no doxology. Not once. Not in any of them. Luke's version ends where Matthew's oldest versions end, with a petition for deliverance and then silence. Think about what that means. If the doxology had been original, if Jesus had actually concluded the prayer with, "For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever," then Luke, recording the same teaching from the same tradition, would have included it. The systematic absence of the doxology from every single Greek manuscript of Luke is not a coincidence. It is the manuscript tradition telling you, as clearly as manuscript evidence can tell you anything, that the doxology was not part of the original prayer. This is what textual critics call a systematic absence. A single manuscript without the doxology could be a scribal error. Two manuscripts without it is significant. But every Greek manuscript of Luke, every single one without exception, ending before the doxology, while independently the two oldest Matthew manuscripts also end before it. That is not variation. That is the tradition speaking in one voice. The doxology did not fall out of the manuscripts through careless copying. It was never in the manuscripts to begin with. It was added. This is precisely the kind of problem Baruch Spinoza was working on in 1670. Spinoza did not have Sinaiticus. The manuscript would not be discovered by the scholar Constantine von Tischendorf for another 174 years. Tischendorf found it at St. Catherine's Monastery in 1844, famously saving a portion of it from a basket of documents the monks were using for kindling and publishing the full text in 1862. Spinoza was working with what he had: the Latin Vulgate, various Greek sources available in Amsterdam, the Complutensian Polyglot of 1514 to 1517, and his own method. The Complutensian Polyglot was a remarkable document, a multi-column Bible printed in Alcalá de Henares, Spain, between 1514 and 1517, presenting the Old Testament in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, and the New Testament in Greek and Latin side by side. It was commissioned by Cardinal Jiménez de Cisneros, one of the most powerful churchmen in Spain, as a monument to Christian scholarship. Spinoza would have used it as one of his comparative sources, and a scholar working through Matthew chapter 6 in the Complutensian Polyglot would have seen the doxology, because the Greek text printed in the Complutensian Polyglot was based on Byzantine manuscript traditions that already contained the addition. Spinoza, in other words, may not have had the specific evidence of the two oldest manuscripts, but he had the method that the evidence, when it arrived, would confirm. And his method was this: when a text exists in more than one version, when the same passage appears in different forms across different sources, the interpreter must ask two questions. Which version appears in the older sources? And what institutional interest is served by the later version? Those two questions, applied to the Lord's Prayer, produce an answer that is not ambiguous. The older sources, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, every manuscript of Luke, do not have the doxology. The later sources have it. The question then is, what institutional interest is served by the addition? The answer is not cynical. It is human. The early Christian communities prayed together. When they prayed the Lord's Prayer in corporate worship, they needed a sense of closure, a liturgical ending that brought the congregation together at the conclusion of the petition. Jewish prayer practice already had doxological endings. 1 Chronicles chapter 29 verse 11, and this will be recognizable to anyone who knows their doxology, says, "Thine, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty." That language predates Christianity by centuries. Jewish worshippers already knew how prayers ended. Christian communities inheriting that tradition almost certainly developed a closing doxology for corporate recitation. There is a 1st or 2nd century document called the Didache, the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, that contains a similar doxological ending, though the exact wording differs from the one that ended up in the King James Bible. Scribes who were also worshippers began writing what they heard in church into what they copied from manuscripts. This is not forgery. There is nothing sinister about it. A scribe in the 3rd or 4th century, copying the Gospel of Matthew, has said the Lord's Prayer with its doxological ending every week of his adult life. When his pen reaches the end of chapter 6, verse 13, his ear expects the ending he has always heard. He writes what he knows. Over centuries, across hundreds of copies, the liturgical habit slowly enters the biblical text. John Chrysostom, the great preacher of Antioch and Constantinople, quotes the doxology in a homily on Matthew sometime around 400 CE. That is, as best as scholarship can determine, the first major church father to use it in a sermon on that passage. 400 years after Jesus, if the doxology had been original, if Jesus had said those words to his disciples on the hillside, we would expect to find it in the writings of the church fathers from the 1st and 2nd centuries. We do not. Origen does not quote it in his commentary on Matthew in the 3rd century. The Didascalia Apostolorum, an early 3rd century church manual, does not include it. Justin Martyr, writing his first apology in approximately 155 CE, one of our earliest descriptions of Christian worship, describes prayer practices of the early church without any mention of a doxological ending to the Lord's Prayer. The silence of the earliest Christian writers on the doxology is taken together as significant as the silence of the earliest manuscripts. Its appearance in Chrysostom in the early 5th century confirms what the manuscript evidence already shows. This ending came into liturgical use gradually, and its transfer into the biblical text followed. By the time the great Erasmus of Rotterdam was compiling the first printed Greek New Testament in Basel in 1516, the situation had become locked in place by time. Erasmus was working from approximately 5 or 6 Greek manuscripts that were available to him, all of them late Byzantine copies from the 12th century or later. By the 12th century, centuries of liturgical use had thoroughly embedded the doxology in the Byzantine manuscript tradition. Erasmus included it, not because he had examined ancient evidence and judged it original, but because every manuscript he had access to contained it. He had no reason to question it. Codex Sinaiticus was 300 years away from being discovered. He was working from what he had, doing the best he could, and what he had was already downstream of 1,000 years of liturgical contamination. Robert Stephanus printed the Greek New Testament in 1550, building on Erasmus's work. Theodore Beza refined it further. The text that emerged, the Textus Receptus, the received text, became the basis for the Lutheran Bible, for William Tyndale's English translation, and ultimately for the 54 scholars who spent 7 years producing the King James Bible of 1611. Those scholars were learned men who worked with enormous care and devotion. They worked from the bishop's Bible as their base text. They consulted the best Greek scholarship available to them. They prayed over their work, each section assigned to a committee, each committee's output checked by other committees. The whole enterprise, described in King James's own instructions, was meant to produce a Bible that could be used in every church in England, read aloud from every pulpit, understood by every congregation. But they did not have Sinaiticus. They did not have Vaticanus in any useful form. Vaticanus was in Rome, guarded with jealousy, inaccessible to Protestant scholars in England. Sinaiticus was still in a monastery in the Egyptian desert, unknown to anyone in the Western scholarly tradition. The 54 scholars working in 6 companies across Westminster, Cambridge, and Oxford were working from Erasmus's text and from the manuscript tradition he had inherited, a tradition already 1,000 years downstream from the original. They printed the doxology as if it had always been there, because as far as they knew, it always had been. 400 years later, it is printed on bulletins in churches across this country. It is embroidered on samplers. It is the ending children learn when they are first taught to pray. It is the line that brings a congregation together at the close of the prayer Jesus gave his disciples. It is almost certainly a line Jesus never said. When Constantine von Tischendorf published the full text of Codex Sinaiticus in 1862, and scholars began comparing it systematically against the Textus Receptus, the absence of the doxology became impossible for serious scholarship to ignore. The revised version of 1881, the first major English revision to incorporate the new manuscript evidence, moved the doxology to a footnote. Every modern critical edition of the Greek New Testament, including the Nestle Aland 28th edition and the United Bible Society's Greek New Testament, either places the doxology in double brackets indicating near certain inauthenticity, or removes it to a footnote entirely. Bruce Metzger, in his textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, assigned the doxology a D rating, the lowest possible confidence rating in the textual critical system. A D rating means the committee was virtually certain the reading was not original to Matthew. To understand what that means, consider the scale. An A rating means the original text is certain, B means nearly certain, C means some doubt exists, and D means the committee considered the text almost certainly not original. The doxology of the Lord's Prayer received the worst possible rating. Metzger's commentary was first published in 1971. It has been used in seminaries across the country ever since. Every pastor trained in the last 50 years who attended an accredited seminary studied textual criticism. Every one of them encountered the Metzger commentary. Every one of them learned that the doxology was almost certainly not original to Matthew. And yet, most Protestant churches kept saying the doxology as if none of this had happened, as if 1844 had not occurred, as if Sinaiticus had not been digitized and made freely available to anyone with an internet connection, as if Metzger had not published his commentary in 1971. The Catholic Church, as it happens, does not say the doxology during the Mass. They end the Lord's Prayer at "Deliver us from evil," following Jerome's Vulgate, which also lacks the doxology and which Jerome translated from older sources in the 4th century. On this specific point, the Catholic liturgical tradition is closer to the oldest surviving manuscripts than most Protestant congregations are. I find that quietly remarkable every time I think about it. The NIV places the doxology in brackets in Matthew and removes it entirely from Luke. The NRSV puts it in a footnote. The scholarship is not hidden. It is printed in small type at the bottom of pages in study Bibles that sit in the pews of the same churches that say the doxology every Sunday morning. Stay with me on this. I'm not angry at the congregation in that sanctuary in November 2020. They were saying what they were taught. Every person in that room learned the Lord's Prayer the way I did, from a mother or a teacher or a Sunday school class, passed down one generation to the next, entirely confident in what they were saying. I am not angry at the King James translators. They were working from what they had, and what they had was the best scholarship of their age. They had no access to the manuscript evidence that would have told them otherwise. What I feel is something harder to name than anger. The Lord's Prayer is the one moment in the Gospels where a disciple specifically asks Jesus to teach them how to pray. Luke chapter 11, verse 1. Lord, teach us to pray, as John also taught his disciples. That is the context, a direct request. Teach us. And Jesus answers with the prayer we know, the prayer that has been said at every funeral and wedding and Sunday morning service in the Christian world for 2,000 years. The ending of that prayer, the most triumphant, most recognizable part of it, the part that lands in a room like a door closing gently, is, as best as scholarship can determine, not part of what Jesus taught that day. It was added, not by a malicious actor, not by a conspiracy, added gradually, organically, by communities who wanted a proper ending to a prayer they loved, who wrote into their copies of the text what their ears already expected to hear. A church full of grieving people finished that prayer together on a cold November afternoon, with a line that Jesus almost certainly never gave them. I think about teaching the Lord's Prayer to Sunday school students in Knoxville in the 90s. The Sunday school room at First Baptist Broadway had cinder block walls painted a pale institutional yellow and a chalkboard at the front that dated from before I was born. We would go through the prayer line by line. I had a practice of writing each section on the board and asking the children what they thought it meant, having them put it in their own words, the way I had been taught to teach. The children were always most interested in the last line, the one with the big words kingdom and power and glory. They liked saying it together. They liked the sound of it. For thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. The rhythm of it was satisfying in the way that a well-built sentence is satisfying. It lands, it closes, it resolves. I taught it with the same confidence with which I had been taught. There was no hesitation in me, no caveat, no sense that any part of that prayer required examination. I was teaching children how to pray. I was teaching them the prayer Jesus gave his disciples. The thought never once crossed my mind that the ending might have been added by a committee of worshippers 500 years after Jesus died. Why would it? Nobody told me to look. That is the specific thing Spinoza spent his life documenting. Not that the church is evil, not that the people inside it are dishonest, but that institutions which are responsible for preserving sacred texts are also inevitably shaped by the texts they preserve, and they shape those texts back over time through the accumulated weight of their practices, their liturgies, their habits, their needs. The doxology is a perfect case study. Congregations needed an ending. The ending they used filtered back into the manuscript tradition. The manuscript tradition was standardized by Erasmus into the Textus Receptus. The Textus Receptus became the King James Bible. The King James Bible became, for 400 years of English-speaking Christianity, the Word of God, as it had always been. Spinoza gave us the method to trace that process. When a text exists in multiple versions, ask which appears in older sources and which appears later. Ask what institutional interest is served by the later version. Follow the evidence wherever it leads, without deciding in advance what you want to find. The evidence for the doxology is unambiguous. The oldest manuscripts don't have it. It enters the tradition gradually. It serves a genuine liturgical need. It becomes, through centuries of repetition, indistinguishable from the original. That's the truth of it. The Lord's Prayer taught by Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 ends at, "Deliver us from evil." Everything after that was given to us by the church, not by Jesus. The church gave us something we clearly needed, a way to close a prayer together, a way to end a shared moment with shared words, a sense of collective arrival. That is not nothing. Those words in that November sanctuary meant something to the people who said them, including me. But they did not come from the teacher who was asked to teach his disciples how to pray. Knowing that changes something. I am not sure it changes what you do on Sunday morning. That is your business, not mine. But it changes the question you are allowed to ask when you open the book. And the question, what is actually in the oldest sources and what was added later and by whom and for what reason, is the question Spinoza formalized in 1670. And that scholarship has been applying ever since. We're still using it. Because it works. Because the manuscripts answer the question honestly if you're willing to read what they say.